Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to this global stakeholder capacity building session, preparation for the June 2025 Bonn Climate Conference and the Belém Climate Summit, COP 30. It's been organized by the University of North Carolina Water Institute and co-sponsored by Stakeholder Forum for a Sustainable Future. I'm Charles Newhan of Stakeholder Forum and your moderator today. For those of you unfamiliar with Stakeholder Forum, it is an international not-for-profit NGO that has, for more than 25 years, been working to advance sustainable development at all levels. Stakeholder Forum seeks to provide a bridge between those who have a stake in sustainable development and the international forums where decisions are made in their name. Today's webinar will, among other things, prepare those of you hoping or planning to participate in your first UNFCCC COP and those in need of a refresher. As you can see from your screens, I am joined by Felix Dodds, who is Adjunct Professor at the Water Institute of the University of North Carolina and a fellow at Stakeholder Forum. And we are also joined by Jamie Cummings, Environmental Policy Analyst at the Woodwell Climate Research Center within its government relations team and an associate at Stakeholder Forum. Now, one of the things that you'll have to your great advantage today is that Felix and Jamie have attended multiple recent COPs. So they have a real insider view of how the experience works, how to manage relationships with governments, how to navigate the entire system, and also a unique perspective that's been given to them by attending multiple events in both Bonn and at the full COP summits. Now, a bit of housekeeping before I hand the floor over to Felix and Jamie. As you'll see, attendee cameras and microphones are muted, and they will remain so throughout the webinar. However, we will make time to address questions from the attendees at the end of the workshop if there's time to do so. We will certainly make an effort to do that. Now, those questions should be submitted to the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Don't put them in the chat section. And I say that because the chat section is meant for you to communicate with each other, share details, maybe even add some relevant documents or links that others would benefit from related to the subject today. Also, bear in mind that in the Q&A section, you can vote up questions. So if you see a question that is along the lines of what you were hoping to ask, or is this something that you also feel would be an important one for the team to answer, if you upvote it, it'll help us focus on a handful or more of the questions that we'll be able to answer in the time that we have. And lastly, two more things. The session is being recorded, and a link to that recording and to the presentation will be sent to you via the Zoom platform tomorrow. Those of you who've been on Zoom before will be familiar with that. One more thing, we're also going to have during the session a little pop-up poll. I'm not quite sure when we're going to do that, but at some point Felix or Jamie will prompt us to do it, and then we'll just ask you to take that poll, and then we'll certainly share the results of that as well. So having said all of that, it's now time for our session. Felix, I'm going to hand the floor over to you, and you'll let me know when you want slides to be advanced.
I think that's very kind, but I think Jamie's got the first slide. So I'm going to hand back to Jamie.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I'll kick it off. Thanks, Charles, so much for the introduction, and thanks to Stakeholder Forum for co-sponsoring this event. It's great to be with you all. We've done this a couple times before, and it always has great attendance and feedback. So yeah, looking forward to another good conversation. So Charles went over this a bit, but this presentation is for anyone who's hoping or planning to participate in the UNFCCC SB subsidiary bodies meeting or the COP coming up in November. This could be your first time, or maybe you've been many times before and you just want a refresher. So just to highlight that the SBs will be in Bonn, June 16 through the 26th, and then COP 30 will be in Belém in the Amazon, November 10 to 21. Next slide. Pass it to you, Felix.
Hi, thanks. We just wanted to kind of put things into perspective. I mean, having been engaged in global negotiations, not just on climate, but on the Sustainable Development Goals and biodiversity and other areas, you have to always think about what is the political space that we're operating in compared to what's going on in the world, because what's possible is dictated by what's happening outside of the rooms of negotiations. So you may have the best idea to move forward climate change, maybe a reform idea, maybe an issue that needs to be highlighted more than it is, but the world is not in a very good place. And this slide is just to point that out. And so just, sometimes you're in this period where you're defending more than moving forward. We're in a period of defending because of much of the military activities that are going on around the world, and the election of Trump to the White House, the US pulling out of the UNFCCC, and the last year will turn out probably to be the highest level of overseas development assistance that we've ever had. This year, we're going to see a fall off. And I think much more polarization that we've seen in the world. And it makes it very difficult for our voices on what is possibly one of the most important issues that we'll have to face, this generation will have to face, to be able to move those things forward. That doesn't mean you don't push forward. It just means that you have to defend at the same time. So just be aware of what you can do, and maybe at this point baby steps are more possible than big steps, but those baby steps create the possibility for bigger movements further down the road. Charles, next slide.
So just to bring in a bit of personal piece, because I know that sometimes these climate negotiations can feel difficult to relate to. So I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, which was the victim of a recent very extreme hurricane, Hurricane Helene, saw catastrophic flooding and really just changed the landscape incredibly. And estimates show that there were close to $53 billion in damages from Hurricane Helene in North Carolina. So something we're going to talk a lot about today is climate finance. How do we go forward from things like losses and damages that come from climate change? And just to note that the World Meteorological Organization, WMO, has 2023 and 24 as warmest years on record. We're approaching 1.18 degrees Celsius of warming, closer to 1.5, the 2-degree target from the Paris Agreement. So as governments and other stakeholders gather in Belém in November for this UN climate change conference, the sense of urgency and ambition really has never been more critical. Next slide, please, Charles. So this is a bit of the agenda, what we're going to address today. We'll go through the history of the climate change negotiations process. We'll talk about how the UNFCCC, its secretariat, and subsidiary bodies prepare for these meetings. We'll talk about the most recent climate summit, that was COP29 in Baku in Azerbaijan, the outcomes and legacies, and what we haven't yet accomplished. We'll talk a bit about why it's interesting to attend, what is ways to engage, and we'll do a bit of a case study on one of the stakeholder groups. We'll talk about negotiating groups and key people that you should know who will be on the ground. And then we will talk about what to expect in these upcoming preparatory sessions in June in Bonn. Then we'll move into COP30. What are going to be the key issues? We'll talk a bit about the logistics that we know for COP30. We'll go beyond the negotiations, and then we will discuss the key dates for you to have in your diaries and calendars for 2025 and 26. Next slide. So let's talk a bit about the history of climate change negotiations from the World Climate Conferences at the start to COP30. Next slide. So this is a great timeline that should be helpful for you to understand the context of where the negotiations come from. And really a key date to know is 1992. This is the Earth Summit, which is when the UNFCCC is officially signed and created and decided that this is something that countries from around the world want to commit to. And at the time, 165 countries signed on to the creation of the UNFCCC, and now we're around 199 countries and recognized parties. So we finally see the true ratification come together in 1994. And then we begin the periods of the COPs, the first conferences of the parties and the meetings. The next important date is 1997. This is the Kyoto Protocol. This is an important date because this is when we had developed countries first agree to set some binding emissions reductions target. This was a bit of a challenge for many countries because they didn't like the binding targets. And so many, including some of the largest emitters like the United States, did not sign on to the Kyoto Protocol. So then we move forward to 2009. This is the Copenhagen Climate Accord. And this is when we see a recognition that the binding targets are problematic. And so we sign on to this climate accord, which is non-binding in international law, and sets the first finance target, which is $100 billion from developed countries by 2020. It also establishes the Green Climate Fund, which is one of the largest funding mechanisms within the UNFCCC, and it establishes that all countries, developed and emerging economies, will begin to report on their emissions and climate plans. Then we move forward to 2015. This is the Paris Agreement, one that most people are very familiar with. And this is where we set the 1.5 degrees Celsius target to keep temperature well below 2 degrees Celsius, which scientists in the IPCC and elsewhere had determined really would be a detrimental turning point. And then we also see this is when the nationally determined contributions come about, where countries will begin reporting on their very detailed climate plans, how they will keep their emissions to stay within that 1.5 degree target. And then we jump ahead to 2024. This is the most recent climate summit, as I mentioned, in Baku in Azerbaijan. We finally have a new finance target. We'll talk a bit more about this in the coming slides, but this is the new collective quantified goal, or the NCQG, which replaces that $100 billion goal. And we begin discussing preparations for new NDCs, and again, to continue that path to keep the warming below 2 degrees Celsius. So that's sort of where we are now and a bit of the history. And I'll pass it to Felix in the next slide to talk about how the UNFCCC prepares.
Thanks very much, Jamie. Some people are putting hands up, and I just point out we're not going to have people ask questions that way. You have to put the questions in the Q&A, and I like that people are putting their details in the chat. We'll try and save that as well and let you have a copy of that so that you can contact people who maybe you didn't manage to get their details down during the webinar. Clearly, you know, we're in a position now where the movement towards bringing climate change target towards 1.5 is, shall we say, very unlikely. And so, you know, the Secretary General of the UN emphasized that limiting global warming to 1.5 remains technically feasible, but only if emissions fall by 9% annually until 2030. It's very unlikely that's going to happen. So we're looking at a 1.5 to 2 degree world. And so in your thinking, you should think, what does that look like as well? Next slide. So the next period of slides are going to be a little bit dense at times. And so we've added in the underneath each of the slides lots of more detailed notes. So I'm not going to go into huge detail because it's extremely insider and you may not be interested in it, but you need to be aware of what the governing bodies are and which of those are going to be useful to the work that you're doing. So I will try and give you some information, but the rest of the information you'll have underneath each of the slides when you get the whole package. Now, we talked about the Conference of the Parties. It has a bureau, and there are 11 members of the bureau, which are made up of regional representatives, the president of the COP, and chairs of the two subsidiary bodies. And the bureau kind of acts as a management group within the context of the negotiations. It's useful to know who your regional representative on that is, and they're usually from the UN regions, the 5 UN regions, and I'll come to that next. But they've also got a seat for small island developing states. So depending on what you are, it's worth finding out who that person is. It's on the website. The COP presidency rotates between the UN regions, where at the moment in COP 30, so we're looking at Latin America and the Caribbean, they will have COP 35. And so for the COP 31, it's going to be in Europe and Western Europe and other group, and that includes Turkey, and there are 2 candidates to host it, Australia and Turkey. If you are someone who thinks you don't want an oil state, then Turkey would be your choice. If you want someone, if you're more focused on human rights, then maybe Australia would be the one that you think. We should know, I think, by the end of Bonn who that's going to be. The reason why you move between the regions is to ensure that, in a sense, each of the region has an ability to host a climate meeting, but it also allows a much larger participation from the stakeholders in that region, so that we don't end up too much balance towards developed country participation. So I think it's a good idea to rotate. It can be problematic for other reasons. There are different versions of what you meet in Bonn. There are bits that are dealing with the Kyoto Protocol still. There are bits which are dealing with Paris, which is known as CMA. So if you see CMA, you'll know that's Paris. If you see CMP, you'll know it's Kyoto. The UN Secretariat is a really important one. It sets up the logistics in the context of Bonn, and then it has a host country agreement with whoever's hosting it, and that will have particular things that have to be abided by. And then there are 2 subsidiary bodies, the subsidiary body for scientific technological advice and subsidiary body of implementation. If you could move to the next slide, that will be good. So there's a number of slides that I'm not going to go into detail with, but these are things that will be meeting in Bonn and possibly also at the COP. And so one of the big problems that we have is that the amount of bodies that have been set up over the period since the 92 signing of the UNFCCC have expanded. And so there's a big discussion going on how to simplify that to make it more effective, and also how it can support, these are policy making bodies, how it can support better the implementation of their decisions. And so, adaptation committee is pretty obvious. The adaptation fund board supervises and manages the adaptation fund that exists. There's an advisory board for Climate Technology Center, and that's to help technology transfer. We just passed the Article 6, which dealt with carbon trading, and we'll come a little bit back to that later. If we go on to the next slide. And so again, you'll see a number of particular committees. The Executive Committee on Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage links in to The Loss and Damage Fund, and I have not followed that on where that's gone. Maybe when we get a little bit later onto loss and damage, Jamie can tell us whether that has actually all been sorted out into a more coherent cluster of activities. You've got the Joint Implementation Supervisory Committee, which guides the Paris verification process for particular projects that have been put there. You've got the Katowice, I can't even pronounce it, Katowice Committee of Experts on the Implementation Response Measures. You've got a least developed country expert group, because it's often the least developed and least developed countries who are hit most by climate change, and the ability to start to help them to work as a group, because often climate agreements are focused at the globe and not focused at particular countries in levels of development. So it's quite important. Next slide. And so again, a number of particular committees. The Standing Committee on Finance is meant to kind of look at all the different financing that's going on, the Adaptation Fund, the Loss and Damage Fund, the Green Climate Fund, to try and pull that together. And Brazil's been doing a bit of work on that in between the meeting in Bakar and the meeting in Brazil, in Belém. So I think we'll find a little bit more information about that when we get to Bonn in a couple of weeks' time. The Technology Executive Committee, again, is about technology transfer. How can we make sure that developing countries can get access to technology that is within their financial means? You've got a compliance committee for the Paris Agreement. You've got a capacity building committee. You've got a transitional committee now, the Loss and Damage Fund. Next slide. So these are sections of the UNFCCC. So you'll see in Bonn meetings of all of these different groups. And so in addition, there will be mandatory meetings that are happening. So my memory, and I may have got it wrong in the sense that they may have finished that, is there'll be mandatory meetings, for example, on oceans. There'll be, I think, mandatory meetings on the implementation of the global stocktake. So in addition to this core group of things, you'll find additional meetings. Okay, next slide. So what we've tried to do here is to give you a pictorial, but this is me, I think. And so it shows the development of some of the bodies in the time periods that we've gone through. And it's very difficult to get a UN body, and it's not the UN's fault, it's member states' fault, to kind of close down an existing space and merge it with another. So part of what Brazil said it wanted to do is it wants to try and address this. I don't think in the present political climate it's very easy to do that. But again, for Brazil, it may be that it's a number of connecting COPs that can start to simplify what we're addressing. If we could move to the next slide. So this is again a pictorial representation. You've got the Bureau, you've got the permanently subsidiary bodies, and what we're trying to show here is how they link together and what the hierarchy is. Where do they go through? So we'll go in a second to, what the informal meetings or contact groups and etc. But what this means is that the two subsidiary bodies are the principal bodies of the convention, and they meet, they make decisions, but then they still have to go to a meeting of a full meeting of the COP, because not all countries have large delegations who can be involved in the subsidiary elements. So what would happen is the adaptation committee would make a decision, it would probably go to the subsidiary meeting, and then it will go to the COP. So there's a COP, an opportunity for countries to change a decision or to revise a decision. There's more of this diagram on the next slide. And I think Jamie drew all this because it was even more kind of fuzzy before. And so, or maybe Tanner. And so again, you'll see the links into where these things are going. So the Technology Executive Committee will fit under the SBSTA, but it will have technology mechanism, or you'll look at the consultative group on experts on national communications, the expert group said. So there is a process leading up to the subsidiary bodies and then to the convention itself. And the same on the finance side. If you want to move to the next slide. So what types of meetings? That was what I was talking. So plenaries are for everyone to go to, and a plenary meeting could be of the whole of the COP, or it could be, you could say it's a plenary meeting, but the SBSTA meetings, the different SBSTA meetings will have a full SBSTA meeting, which will then okay any of the sub areas, which we'll go through in a minute. And they'll report to the full SBI meetings of the things, and then they'll go in. And then you'll have contact groups where you'll have 2 co-facilitators open to observers, unless 1/3 of the people object. Informal meetings, these are closed, and they'll have 2 facilitators, one from developed, one from developing. You'll have informal drafting groups, not open to observers. You've got mandated events, like I suggested, ocean dialogue, and then you'll have bilateral meetings that are happening all the time between governments. So your plenaries will be like the Conference of the Parties, or the Paris Agreement, or the Kyoto Protocol, because not everyone signed up and agreed to each of those. So only the bodies that signed up to the Kyoto Protocol can be a part of the decision-making process at them. Next slide. I think it's you, Jamie.
Yeah, thanks, Felix. So let's talk a little bit about COP29, the outcomes and the legacies, and sort of what wasn't achieved. So for those who aren't familiar, COP29 is the most recent COP that took place in Baku in Azerbaijan in November of 2024, so a few months ago. Next slide, please, Charles. So some of the major outcomes, the biggest one that I mentioned earlier is the new collective quantified goal for climate finance, or the NCQG. This was really the main sticking point, the main negotiation topic for this COP in Baku. And folks thought that if we didn't come away with a new finance target, that this COP would be seen really as a failure. So although many countries believe that the target is, not enough, not the goal that we needed, it is a huge success story that there was an agreement. So what is the new NCQG? So really it calls on all actors. This includes not only parties, but the private sector, other development organizations, to raise 1.3 trillion in US dollars per year for supporting emerging economies in their climate adaptation and loss and damage, etc. journey. And then the agreement within the parties is the mobilization of 300 billion by 2035. So if you remember, the goal was 100 billion, and now really we've tripled that number to 300 billion. So that's a bit about the NCQG. The other big success story was Article 6. So this has been a really long, very technical, complicated negotiation item for many years. And finally, it was operationalized and agreed upon in Baku. So essentially, this is the formation of international carbon markets. The third piece was some more negotiations on the fund for responding to loss and damage. So just to touch a bit more about that, as Felix mentioned, there are some more recent updates. They have just had their first high-level dialogue, which is expected to happen annually. It happened on the outskirts of the World Bank spring meetings. And the next meeting of the board will be from the 9th to the 11th of July. So upcoming after the bond meetings in the Philippines. The Philippines is the host country for this fund. And right now for pledges, we're up to around $768 billion US dollars for commitments to the fund. These are commitments by parties. So around 765 million US dollars are committed to that fund so far to respond to loss and damage in emerging economies. And then the last piece that was a major topic of negotiation was related to adaptation. This is the new framework for the Global Goal on Adaptation, or the GGA. And the idea behind this is that they are trying to come up with a set of indicators to help establish where folks are on their adaptation efforts. So this began at COP28 in Dubai. The UAE framework for global climate resilience is another way you'll hear it referred to. And they are just trying to come up with indicators for key sectors like food, water, health. And this will be a continued topic, which we'll discuss again coming up for the subsidiary bodies. Okay, next slide. And Felix, back to you.
Thanks, Jamie. I just remembered that's something I forgot to say earlier. We're still under the Azerbaijan presidency. The Brazilian presidency doesn't formally take over until the COP itself. And so that one of the interesting potential reforms, which I think might be a good idea, will be what we have at the United Nations Environment Assembly, which you elect the Bureau at the end of a meeting, and then they're responsible for the next event, because at the moment Azerbaijan were president for the Baku thing. It would have been really sensible to hand over to Brazil at the end of Azerbaijan to be able to allow Brazil to have more of an influence on setting the agenda or kind of bringing people together for the Belém COP. So it's just one of the areas that there's some interesting ideas out there. So COP29 outcomes also included the Marrakesh Partnership and presidential initiatives. And there are a number of presidential initiatives that came out, particularly the three that I've identified. They're not the only ones, but the Azerbaijan presidency. And I would have to say, of all of the COPs, the Azerbaijan logistics was, in my viewpoint, the best. I think they did an amazing job. And I think that they surprised a lot of people in the sense of they had never been engaged in the climate negotiations before. So the presidential initiatives from Azerbaijan were trying to deal with hydrogen, because we need to have a more global standard on the development of how hydrogen should go. We'll have to see where that initiative goes. There's a declaration on multi-sector action pathways to resilient and healthy cities. So working with local and subnational governments. I think that was really, really good. And I think local and subnational governments play a critical role in implementation of all of the climate agreements, because they're really at where you do all the work. And there was a declaration on climate action in tourism, and I'm part of a thing called SunX, which does some work on tourism. I was quite interested in it. I wasn't sure that it delivered as much as we had hoped, and I think there's more work that needs to be done there, but that's one of the reasons for having key presidential initiatives. And some people say there are too many of them, and it's difficult to keep an idea, a one place where you can go for them. And I think that's a really important thing. We need to bring all the presidential initiatives really into a more coherent, I guess, space under the action agenda of the COPs. And then there were two activities on the Marrakesh Partnership, which is really action agenda. The renewal of the partnership itself, that it would carry on for another 5 years, a collaboration between parties and stakeholders. So the action agenda and the Marrakesh process and all of that is where stakeholders can have a really important role in being involved in developing new partnerships. And I will mention a bit of that at the end. And then there was some water action. And I have a particular interest in this. As we'll see later, I set up the first Water and Climate Coalition in 2007. And it's taken a long while for water to come onto the political agenda. And I'll come back to that in a minute. If you could move to the next slide, Charles, that would be good. I think it's back to you. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Felix. So let's talk a little bit about what wasn't achieved. As Felix mentioned, this can be a very contentious process at times. It is up to one country to say we don't agree with something, and then the negotiation cannot move forward. It's consensus-based process. So let's talk about some of the issues that remain unresolved. The first one is the logistics of the global stocktake and the global stocktake dialogue, or the GST, as you may see it referred to. So the global stocktake, the idea is to take stock of where we are as parties in achieving our NDCs, in achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. And really a lot of the logistical issues are around the timeline that has remained unresolved, and how the GST intersects with some of the other negotiation items. The next piece that was unresolved is the Just Transition Work Program. So the idea behind this is, how will we transition away from fossil fuels, considering things like the workforce, and people who work in that industry need to be prepared for future industries. And this is really a main focus this year for environmental justice groups. And so you may see a lot of organizing around the Just Transition Work Program at the Bonn conferences, as well as COP30 in Belém. And then the last piece we also already mentioned is the venue for COP31. Where is it going to take place? Really, it's down to Australia and Turkey, and remains unresolved, but hopefully we will have a decision in Bonn. So let's talk a little bit more about Bonn. We can go to the next slide. And Felix, I'll let you take it away for SB62.
Yeah, and just again, a reflection on some of the issues in the past. Just to indicate that if you're engaging in this process, you have to engage throughout the year and be aware of what's happening. And I say this because the decision, the COP decision to set up loss and damage, I mean, the establishment of it happened on day one of the United Arab Emirates COP28. And so if you were planning to do some work on it, you would have missed that because it was happening in the period running up to that. If you were involved in the carbon market discussion, the Azerbaijan presidency dropped the decision on day one. And so, again, if you were involved in that, there were a number of meetings that were happening, not just in Bonn, but through that whole previous year, that set it up so that they could get a decision. Not all countries are happy about this because it in a sense bounces them into a formal decision at the beginning. But I think if particularly for the carbon markets, if we continued to talk about it, I'm not sure we would have got a decision at the end. And so I think strong presidencies can do that. And we'll come to the Brazilian presidency in a minute. And so just to give you a frame of reference, 12,000 people from the stakeholder groups applied to go to Bonn. There are 1,200 admitted NGOs that are on the list of accredited NGOs. So each of them has to at least be given one place, or assume that they're going to give it one place. There are only 2,000 places to go into COP. So many organizations only got one. And then in addition to that, there is a strong attempt to balance between developed countries and developing countries. And so if they are giving extra badges out, it will tend to go to developing country representatives, which I personally think is really good. We know that at the beginning of the decision on Belém, there are only 28,000 beds. And if you think that there were 60,000 people in Azerbaijan and over 100,000 in United Arab Emirates, Brazil's building additional places for people to stay, but the chances of getting more than 1 or 2 passes is probably very low. And when they move to particular regions, those regional NGOs or stakeholders tend to get any additional passes because it's in their region. So I'm just sharing that with you as a frame of reference. So we're now dealing with the Bonn Conference Center. You can see it. It's a wonderful place. There's a whole story about this, which if you buy me a coffee, I'll tell you about how it came to be, but we will move on to the next slide. So a simpler look at the process, COP, 2 subsidiary bodies, Secretariat, how it fits in, it supports those, it prepares papers. And one of the problems, I would say, is often member states give the Secretariat more work than they have the ability to do. And so one of the other conversations, which has already happened in New York around the General Assembly, is maybe we need to cost out any decision that's being taken and make sure that there's funds there to do that. And then the IPCC clearly inputs. Now, I had hoped, but I failed partly because the German government changed, to get an IPCC meeting happening the weekend before this COP, because we're in that next period on the IPCC, and there will be a special report on cities. And so I was hoping that we would have an opportunity for an ability to talk with those writing from the other stakeholders and member states, but that hasn't happened this time, so maybe someone else will find an idea. Next slide. So here are your 2 people who are in charge of the different bits of the subsidiary bodies, the Ugandan ambassador, Adoni, and the Australian representative, Julia. They've both been involved in the process for a long time, and they will be overseeing the subsidiary bodies, which we'll come to, and helping them where they can to be able to engage and finish their work. So the hope is that subsidiary bodies will finish their work in Bonn, and they will pass over a final agreement to the COP to be ratified. That's in many cases unlikely to happen, so the subsidiary bodies will continue under SB 63 during the COP. You can go to the UNFCCC website, and you can, if you need to ask either of these people questions, there is an ability to send them an email. There's an email for each of the chairs to ask them something or whatever. They will do particular webinars at different points. So, they're very accessible. I haven't worked with a donor, but I am aware of Julia, and I think she's very approachable. I mean, whether she is as approachable chairing SBI as she was when she wasn't, we'll have to see. But next slide. And so just to give you an idea, and this is, in a sense, you have to be accredited. And I say this as if it's common sense, but when we did the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg, a colleague of mine, Jan Gustav Strandenes, was called into a cinema complex with about 500 people who were yelling that they couldn't get in, and they couldn't get into the meeting because they hadn't bothered to accredit. And so your first thing is to accredit. And if you are not accredited yet, the process for accreditation will, I think, close in July for COP31. And so you need to go through the process of doing that so that you can get your organization accredited. The Brazilians have been very, very clear. This isn't just, about the COPs. It's also about linking the G20 in South Africa and the G7 in Canada. So they see these and the World Bank meetings, as Jamie talked about in the loss and damage space. These are part of the ecosystem. So if you're following an issue and it's on the agenda for the G7 as well, you should be engaging in the different groups. And you'll find around pretty much all of the environment space that the groups that exist in one way or another were defined in 1992 as the 9 major groups. And the reason for that was that the term civil society reduces space to one speak, while the stakeholder approach and the constituency approach in the UNFCCC gives women their own space, gives youth their own space, ensures that Indigenous peoples have their space. So it's quite an important thing, and that's now been copied in the G7 and the G20. Next slide. So the two subsidiary bodies, they address different things. So on implementation, it says it in its title. It's trying, though, to be honest, the UNFCCC is a policy-making body. And the reason why it's by consensus, by the way, is because there's never been an agreement on what a decision should be taken by. And so therefore, by the Vienna Convention on Treaties, it automatically is by consensus. But within the Vienna Convention on Treaties, there are other options that they can have, but governments have never managed to do that. Different forums have managed to persuade governments not to object to consensus, but to object to a particular paragraph or something. So Turkey and Syria, during the Rio+5 process, objected to the text that dealt with water. And so they signed the whole thing, but they didn't agree to the text that had been in water. So there are ways that the Secretariat can help in these things. So, the issue on implementation is obvious. That the idea is to push implementation, and then the subsidiary body on science and technology is obvious as well. It's moving towards ensuring things like the IPCC information comes in and helps the make the decisions. If you move to the next slide. Yeah, so these are, I may have got two versions of this. So SB 62 and 63, I've just listed the items on the agenda. So I would only highlight one of them because it's relevant, which is that the Sharm el-Sheikh Joint Work Programme on Implementation of Climate Action on Agriculture and Food Security is in both SBI and Substa, and it will have a workshop on the 17th of June. I'm not sure I've seen an ability to sign up to go to that workshop yet. And it may be because of the space that the people who can go will have to go through the constituency bodies. So often, particularly in the intersessional period, then the 9 major groups will be asked to nominate people to go to those meetings. And so depending on the room size, will depend on how many stakeholders can go. And if that is such, then you need to be a member of one of the 9 major groups. You can join 2 or constituencies. I'm really just engaged. I'm engaged in the industry group, and I'm also engaged in the science group. And the science and academic group, what's called the Ringo group. And they don't take a position, but they have a lot of information. And so it's definitely worth going to one of their meetings. And so if you're following the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage, there's a space where that will happen. If you move to the next slide. And so, again, part of the SBI stuff, you can see it's technology, there's agenda, there's a piece of work. We had a decision on gender, so I'm not sure if it will be an implementation conversation there's going to be a roadmap on financial support and means of implementation. If you move to the next slide. And then the other body, the Substa body, it's got a similar agenda. Not all the same, but it's got a really interesting one for local communities and Indigenous peoples platform. It's got the Just Transition Work Program, which Brazil has been doing a lot of work between the Bukai, the Azerbaijan COP and now. If you move to the next slide. And again, these are just the issues that will be on the agenda. And as you will see when the formal agenda goes up, you'll see when those are happening, at least the first set of meetings. And then you have to look online. You have to sign up if you can to the information from each day, but they'll be on the screens if you're in Bonn, or they'll be on particular screens if you're in Belém. If you move to the next slide. So what are the core issues? Next slide. So the COP30 president have talked about the integration of the sustainable development, biodiversity and climate agendas. So as I said, they're going to try and do some of that through the G20, through COP30, and also through BRICS. They've emphasized to try and decouple negotiations from implementation. So you'll see, and there are already some discussions about how do we make maybe the blue zone into an implementation zone, so much more directed pavilions with directed work on particular strategies. And they are, as Jamie already mentioned, using the World Bank meetings and others to move forward. If you move to the next slide. So the team that Brazil's put together is one I know very well. So Andre Delago wrote a chapter for my last book, and I've known him since I think 2010. He was one of the 5 Brazilian key people who ensured that the Rio+20 meeting was a success. When we arrived in Rio+20, 70% of the text was bracketed, and within 3 days they had cleared the whole text. And he was one of the key people who did that. He's gone on to be ambassador in Japan. He's been on ambassador for Brazil in India. He's a really good person, and they see 5 areas for work, and those are clearly very top line issues, and they'll go down into lower levels as we get closer: mitigation, adaptation, finance, technology, and capacity building. We can move to the next slide. Jamie, I think this is you.
Yeah, thanks. So this is just a bit of helpful mapping. This mapping is done by my colleague, Mati Goldberg, who worked actually within the Secretariat in the Adaptation Division for over 15 years, and now works with Woodwell Climate Research Center. And he's done a great job really just outlining kind of the policy landscape for COP30. And just to note that this is a work in progress. I think some of these may change a little bit, become more clearly priority issues as we more closely approach COP30 in November. So far, we have 3 letters out from the presidency, which kind of helps to outline these issues, but we expect more to come out in the coming weeks and months. So some of the main policy issues, again, Felix has touched on these, but just to drill down, one is the nationally determined contributions, or the NDCs. These are the country's own targets for keeping within the Paris temperature degree limits. We are going to see a lot of talk about the ambition for NDCs for 2035. Countries have already begun releasing their new NDCs and kind of will continue to in the lead up to COP30 for the next 10 years. And we also will see some talk about the implementation of current NDCs. Again, this is a bit in line with the global stocktake process. The next piece is climate finance mobilization. So we have this NCQG, but really the idea is now to get a strategy behind how we mobilize that $1.3 trillion annually, and where that comes from, thinking about new sources of finance, how to really scale that finance, and reduce barriers. And then, as I mentioned, the last piece is on the global stocktake targets. This is going to be in collaboration with the global energy and forestry targets as well, which are some of Brazil's main initiatives. So I'll jump to that green box. So some of Brazil's main initiatives, you probably have seen some press about this Tropical Forest Forever facility or fund, or the TFFF. This is a huge initiative for Brazil. The idea is to end forest degradation and to be able to give funding to countries who have tropical forests to protect, preserve, and continue the growth of those forests. We also see some initiatives to showcase Brazil's bioeconomy, to talk about their national carbon markets that they have already in place. So a lot of focus around forests, of course, because Brazil is a hub for the Amazon. So it makes a lot of sense that they're tying into their natural geography. Another piece I want to highlight here is this idea to unify the Rio Conventions and their targets. So the Rio Conventions are the UNFCCC, which is the climate piece. Then there is the CBD, which is the Conference for Biodiversity. And then the UNCCD, which is for combating desertification. So those are kind of the three Rio Conventions, and they all, of course, have targets that are in line with each other. So how do we better bring together those negotiating frames and unify so they are not so kind of siloed in their approaches? Okay, so looking at the blue box, some of the expected outcomes that we hope to see by COP30. Again, this global goal on adaptation indicators process, they hope to have some indicators finalized for adaptation and resilience. We want to see modalities for that global stock take dialogue confirmed. The mitigation work program, this is a very politically contentious item that we've seen really a halt in progress in previous negotiations. So hoping for some work there. A new gender action plan to be developed. Again, this just transition work program is going to be a big topic of conversation, and we hope to see that advanced. We're going to review the work program for non-market approaches. This is again related to Article 6. And then, like I mentioned, that roadmap to the 1.3 trillion in climate finance, concluding the Baku to Belém roadmap, and really getting kind of a finalized outcome there. And then a couple other items, just there will be some work on technology implementation programs, a bit of focus on transparency and reviewing kind of NDCs, and then Earth Information Day will also happen at COP30. This is about research systems and systematic or observation systems, which help us kind of take stock. And then the last piece I'll talk about is the process innovation that the presidency has been leading. They are creating the Circle of Presidency, which basically is a leadership of the last 10 COPs. So bringing together the presidents to kind of be a leadership body. We'll see how that goes. There's a lot more work on recruiting non-state actors to partner on key issues. These are research organizations, universities, the private sector. They are creating a circle of indigenous leadership. Of course, this is critical in the Amazon and elsewhere. And they want to really showcase that indigenous people care for the earth and really are responsible for a lot of the biodiversity around the world. And then we'll talk a bit more about the special envoys that they've appointed, and also this idea of a global ethical stocktake. So looking less at the technical side of where we are and more on where are we at, morally in our obligation to protect the climate and the planet. And Felix, I'll pass it back to you to talk a bit more about the presidency team and some of the envoys.
Sure. If you could move to the next slide. I think that was really good information. Here's a picture of the team. On the far right is Anatoni, who's the Chief Executive Officer, and she's a former Vice Minister for Climate Change. But I knew her in 1992 as the lead for ActionAid. And then she's gone on to work for the Ford Foundation and a number of other places as well. Next to her is, as you saw earlier, Andre Delago. And then next to Andre Delago is a high-level champion, which is Dan. And he's the CEO of the board of a particular company, Lopec Maxion, which is, I think, named after him. and a world leader in the production of car wheels, and the leading producer of automotive structural components in the Americas. And then clearly President Lula, who, yeah, without him, we would never have had the SDGs, because we would never have had Rio +20, because he made that happen. And then, of course, the Minister, Marina Silva, who's an amazing person. So the Brazilian team is awesome. But remember, it's working in a world where it's not an easy world to be a great presidency. So I hope by having them, then there will be a really, yeah, we'll end up at the end of it in a very clear space for where we need to go next. If you could take the next slide. So I'm going to go through and just put you in, yeah, the names of the people who have been given responsibility as the special envoys. Adnan Amin was the Chief Executive Officer for Dubai. He was also the head of the Secretariat for the Secretary General's Chief Executive Board. He headed ARENA. He knows a lot. So what they've done is they've gone for particular people from different regions. So it's a bit like a friends of the presidency. So these people have very, very good contacts in their respective regions, and so they can go out and sound out what is happening there. It includes the former head of the UNFCCC from Latin America, from Mexico, Patricia. If you can move to the next slide. And so they've also looked at a set of Brazilian ones, which are meant to help. So within Brazil, these are people who, in a sense, will, I guess, work particularly on the Brazilian initiatives, but not just that. They would be a place to go if you're part of the Brazilian stakeholder groups. And if you move to the next slide, then you've got a set of special envoys that are on particular issues. And so if you are following health, which hasn't yet really got onto the agenda, then you have someone to go to kind of understand how you get there. If you're doing urban solutions, which might be particularly local government, then you have a person in Philip Yang who might be able to help that process forward. If you're dealing with agriculture, I'm working on nitrogen, then we have Roberto, who might be a really good person to approach for that. We can move to the next slide. So there's a troika of the presidencies, as we're still within the COP29 presidency. The previous presidency is the United Arab Emirates, and Brazil is the present presidency, and we don't know yet what COP31 will be. But what that enables is the experience that has gone on. It's a bit like the presidency circles that they've got, but this is they're recent. So often it's very important to have the more recent ones, because they've been engaged in the trenches and they know the present negotiators. You know, going back to COP21 may be really good for some experience, but they're likely not to know the lay of the land in the same way. And so they're looking, this troika, to support clearly the national determined priorities and implementation of the United Arab Emirates consensus, to mobilize technical and financial resources. Clearly the Belém to Bakar, the Bakar to Belém roadmap on finance will play a critical role on that. I just saw someone put their hand up. We're not doing hands, so put your questions in the Q&A. And then existing mechanisms, how can we streamline them? I mean, I don't think this is the time when we'll have much of that happening, but I think they can start the process to do that. And so I think it's a really important aim. If we can move to the next slide. This is Jamie, it's you.
Thanks, Felix. So to talk a little bit more about this pre-COP that they'll be hosting. Every year, the presidency hosts a pre-COP session. So this is a bit of preparatory work, maybe even beyond Bonn, to come to some more agreement. And this is going to take place from October 13 to 14 in Brasilia. So these are some really key climate ministers and high-level folks will be invited. and have kind of more discussions that to really narrow down some of these goals. It's expected that around 800 people will attend. So compared to how large the COP typically is, this is a much smaller group that comes together. And this is, again, kind of one of the temperature checks that happens in the lead up to the COP. There are a series of these that happen throughout the year. The Petersburg Dialogues and the Copenhagen Climate Ministerial, both of those have already taken place in March and May and kind of gave us a clearer picture of what the priorities of negotiators would be. So this is one more piece of that. And we'll go to the next slide. Felix, I think it's back to you.
Thanks, Jamie. So COP30 will provide some decisive input in 3 dimensions, or so the presidency is trying to do. They're trying to expand the institutional legacy that we've built over the last 3 decades. We're now in a situation clearly where we are in an adaptation world, and so they'll be dealing with some of that to protect and expand, in a sense, the work where the negotiations aren't just an abstraction. It has to become much more focused on helping to implement, and that's one of the things that they want to do. And clearly, and we'll come to the where we are on the national determined contributions shortly, but there's they have a role in trying to get those governments to make the new commitments, and the commitments were all meant to be in by, I think, the 17th of February, and as we know, they weren't. If we can move to the next slide.
Okay, so let's discuss a little bit about why is it interesting and important for folks and stakeholder groups to attend these bond conferences as well as the COPs. So I'm just going to give a bit of a case study on some stakeholder engagement through my experience with Youngo, which is the youth constituency. So we'll go to the next slide. Okay, so things to think about why to attend. Of course, the main goal would be to influence the text that's going to be negotiated. These are the outcomes that really are making a big difference in how parties around the world approach climate change and address adaptation and finance issues. So another reason would be to cultivate alliances. It's a really great place for networking and can build a lot of momentum around topics that folks are passionate about for future work and for your current work as well. Another reason would be to show your case studies of success. So if we're thinking about approaches that have been successful to increasing resiliency or addressing, new climate technologies, this is a great place to see what has worked in other areas of the world, in communities that maybe have a similar economy to your own or something, and you can go from there to build on those case studies for success. Another reason is it's a great educational opportunity. It's very interesting to learn about how these intergovernmental multilateral negotiations work. It's really quite fascinating to think that we have representation from almost every country in the world come together and try to agree on common targets, against what is arguably the largest threat that our society faces in common. So super fascinating and a lot to learn. As you've probably seen through this presentation, there's so much information to be shared. And then the last piece would be to raise funds for your work. So there are always donors, typically more at the COPs than at the SBs. Those are a lot more technical and focused on negotiations, but often at the COP, there are a lot of donors. And yeah, it's a good place to raise money for the work that you are doing. Okay, next slide, please. So to talk a little bit about how to engage as a stakeholder and an observer organization, there are existing stakeholder groups that have been established since the Rio conference, where you can kind of fit into based on what you work on. So those are BINGO, that's business and industry; ENGO, these are environmental NGOs. You may have heard of CAN International, that's Climate Action Network, and then they have regional and national nodes as well. There's the farmers group for folks working in farms and agriculture. There's the IPO, which is the Indigenous Peoples Organization. There's LGMA, which is local governments and municipal authorities. So especially relevant in the United States right now, where we're seeing a lot of leadership at the local and municipal level as our national administration takes a step back. RINGO, which is the research and independent NGOs. So my organization, Woodwell Climate Research Center, and the University of North Carolina that is putting on this presentation are members of the RINGO group. TUNGO, which is trade unions. There's a women and gender constituency. And then, as I mentioned, there is YOUNGO, which is focused on youth. There are a few others that are kind of informally recognized. There's a faith-based organizations group, a group of parliamentarians, and folks with persons with disabilities that also kind of have informal groups that you can join as well. And there are links, again, we'll share these slides after the fact in the recording, but there are some links there where you can learn more about the Observer Handbook and how to get engaged with these groups. Okay, and I will pass it back to Felix to talk a little bit more about your experience in the water space.
Thanks, Jamie. If you move to the next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, I was very involved in 2007. At that particular point, there was no text in any UNFCCC decision that had the word water in it. And so the Water Coalition was created at what's known as the Water Week in Stockholm. It was a multi-stakeholder coalition. We went to the COP in 2008 to work out how the system worked. And then in 2009, we attended the Bonn meeting in preparation for Copenhagen. We didn't work within the constituencies because we were a multi-stakeholder group. And to get a decision in favor of what you're asking for in the constituency bodies can take a little while. And so we just had a couple of very good lobbyists, and we sat at a particular place because the original Bonn meetings were held in the Maritime Hotel. So there's a particular set of seats you could sit in where no government could get past you without who was going into the negotiations. They had to, you could pick them off. And then there weren't many places to plug in your phone or your computer. So we brought in a multi-plug adapter, which if you wanted as a government to talk, to use my multi-plug adapter, then I had to pitch to you the idea on water. We had the support of the Department for International Development in the UK, who funded this work, which was against the existing policy of the UK in the climate ministry. We had the same thing in the German ministry. We had the ministers' meeting room to use, even though the relevant negotiators for climate were against the idea of water being included in the negotiations. And when we went to the first meeting, there were a number of meetings in 2009 because of Copenhagen. We had to accredit the water government officials as part of the NGO delegation because their ministries wouldn't bring them in. And that, of course, created an embarrassment. And we were able to very quickly work out through promotion in the side events, through setting up the Friends of Water and Climate, in publishing it. We published a daily newsletter, which was recognized by the UNFCCC, that carried on through to, I think, 2012. So it became like a number of other ones by Earth Negotiations Bulletin or by the climate NGOs, the eco things. It became a daily thing where governments were being aware of where water fell into the discussion. And we did manage within that first year to get the text into the Copenhagen Agreement, because we were very focused on which governments we needed, because it's not all governments. In the end, depending on where you're trying to get it, it may be 10, 15, 20 governments who are most important. It's not 199. And so you work out who those are, and then you work on them, and then you're able to move forward. Unfortunately, because Copenhagen imploded, we lost it, but we then got it back in for Cancun. And so it was a very focused multi-stakeholder approach. We had UN agencies supporting us. We had this steering committee that was made up of all the stakeholders, plus the World Health Organization and a number of other parts of the UN system. UN Water were part of it. And we were able to, during that, push forward and get the text into the Cancun Agreement. So as a case study, it's an interesting one. And what we were looking for was to have a workshop around adaptation and mitigation on where water needed to be in the national reports. And that's ultimately set in motion that process. Okay, I think I finished. Next slide.
Yeah, so just show you a photo here and talk a little bit more about the Youngo group, which again is one of those constituencies that you have the opportunity to join. So this is a photo of some Youngo members at the Bonn SB meetings in 2023. So you can see it's a wonderful group of folks really from all over the world. And there are similar groups within the other constituencies. It's a great place to network and meet other folks who are working on similar things as you, and helpful for some advocacy to have kind of that bigger platform behind you. There's leadership elected. Typically, leaders will be one from the Global North and one from the Global South for that regional representation. And they help to organize meetings, which happen usually every day during these conferences at the SBs in Bonn, as well as at COP in the mornings. And they're a great way to start your day, typically a briefing about main issues, places to do some information sharing, ask questions, and learn about actions that are happening for the day. Next slide. So just to talk about some advocacy avenues, how you can engage within a constituency. So this is from the Youngo perspective. Often they have communications. These include social media, which help to put pressure on negotiators, and press conferences as well, where folks can answer questions by press who are there on the ground, which then again can generate attention around certain issues. Direct interventions are an option. So, of course, in the negotiating rooms, typically all of the parties get to speak first and share their opinions, but then usually there is time at the end for these constituencies to insert a statement. Usually it's 1 to 2 minutes, but those are written collaboratively, and then folks can chime in and share, we as the youth constituency want to share the young person's perspective on this negotiating item, and they get to speak. Bilateral meetings are a great way to engage. Typically, you can set up, if you have connections within the space, meetings with different delegations. So this is an image on your screen of the Youngo group meeting with UNICEF on the ground to kind of discuss joint advocacy. You can connect through the Secretariat. They are responsible for responding to some of the to all of the constituency groups. It's a great place for capacity building. There's a lot of knowledge sharing and education that happens. Another reason to join a constituency is that often they will sponsor delegates. I think these constituencies are not well funded, so they don't have a lot of money, but sometimes there are ways for them to supply badges and funding for folks to attend. At least in the Youngo space and maybe in other constituencies throughout the year, there are also local conferences. So that's the LCOI and the RCOI. These are local conferences of youth where kind of the positions are built in advance of these meetings happening in Bonn and in Belém this year. There are actions on the ground. So these are things like formal protests that are sanctioned by the UN Secretariat and security there, but kind of, again, put some pressure on negotiators. Often there are pavilions, which happen in the blue zone, and Youngo has one where they can host events and kind of share things they are working on. And then, yeah, as I mentioned again, it's a place potentially to find some funding. Okay, next slide. So just to talk a little bit more about one of the ways to engage is press conferences. Anyone can organize a press conference. And again, we'll share these slides with you, but there are links here to reserve a press conference room. You have to complete a form and send it in to the UN, UNFCCC press office. And then you can organize a press conference. Press will likely be in the room. You can do outreach to press that you specifically want there. And again, it's a way to kind of get stakeholders' voices in the mainstream media and to have those opinions promoted. So that's a great avenue that will happen again at the ESPYs and in Belém as well. And Felix, I'll pass to you to talk a little bit more about the importance of campaigning.
Next slide, please. Yeah, we're not going to go long into this. And I would say I have a book coming out. It actually comes out on June the 12th, called Environmental Lobbying at the UN. So if you're as an organization doing this, then it's got a lot of case studies, and it might be worth you having one for your library. But, if you're approaching as a campaigning organization, it's important that you know what goals you're trying to, what are you trying to achieve? Too many people go to the meetings without a clear idea of what they're doing. And it might be this, the fundraising thing. I mean, Jamie gave you a clear idea of the 4 or 5 ways that you might be going in. Know the agenda. So too many people turn up and the issue is not on the agenda. That doesn't mean that there isn't a process around it, like health or like oceans, where you can engage, but very important to have that awareness. Know when your country is making their decision. So if you take, for example, the UK, which is where I was born, they will have pretty much started thinking about this after the last COP. And so there'll be a process in the UK where they will be working through what they're going to think their position is going to be at the ESPY. And so you should be engaging with them. If you haven't engaged with them in your capital, they're less likely to be interested in talking to you at Bonn. So it's very important that you have started that dialogue. It may be that they're part of a group. So if it's, for example, Kenya, they'll be part of the Africa group. And so when is Kenya going to be presenting its position to the Africa group? And then the Africa group, when is it going to present its position to the group of 77? So you need to understand that process and when the decisions within the groups are being made, and then when is the decision going to be taken. If the decision is quite close, it might be taken in Bonn, but otherwise it will be taken at the COP. What tools are available? So, for example, do take a extension lead with lots of plugs, because people like to be able to plug their things in. So it helps for you to do that. But I was thinking more in the context of if you go to the Earth Negotiations Bulletin website, all the previous meetings of Bonn and the COPs will have pictures of the negotiators, and we'll come to this very soon. It's well worth looking to see if there's a section that's dealing with the issue that you want to address. Know when to make your position. The earlier you make it, the more impact you have. The later, the less impact you have. You have to know the government officials. If you're focusing just on your government, you should be asking for daily or every 2 days meeting with the government to put your points of view. Know who the key UN people are. Who is the person behind the person chairing the meeting you're going to, who's probably going to be writing up the text from that meeting. And so know that person. Know who's going to support your issue, but also know who's going to be against. And if you can move someone who's against your issue away, and maybe they're not going to be in favor, but they're not going to object. So sometimes it depends on your particular approach. Next slide. Is this me? Wait a second. Okay, so we've vaguely kind of indicated what the key issues are going to be for Belém. And so the work that Brazil is doing on that roadmap to 1.5 will be critical, and it won't end in Belém, but they're hopefully starting to identify the architecture, is this money going to come, how much will come from overseas development aid, how much will come from multilateral development banks, how much will come from the private sector, what do you need to do to make sure the private sector is obeying particular norms like ESG reporting so that you can trust it, what investment frameworks would you have to make sure that not bad investors are going in. And so there's a thing called UNEP has a thing called the Principles of Responsible Investors, so you can see which investors are good. The loss and damage fund, which Jamie talked about, they'll be reporting on the progress, and we heard from her how much money they have at the moment. The national determined contributions, where we'll see by the time we get to the COP how many countries have actually put in new and stronger recommendations. The global goal on adaptation, the indicator issue, and why it's important for Brazil to bring together the biodiversity goals and the most recent conventional biological diversity goals is that you need a package which will be coherent and supportive of each other. And I would say that, as we move to the Sustainable Development Goals review in 27 and beyond, there is a process on indicators which you can go to through the statistical division of the UN, and in that it has what they call tier 1 and tier 2 countries. And so it shows you how many countries have to have that data source being collected to be considered as a indicator. So just because you think a good indicator, you come up with a good indicator, it has to have a number of countries in each region who is already collecting that data for it to be considered. And that will be part of the discussion that we'll have here. And then the operationalization of the carbon markets. If we could move to the next slide. Yeah, so I partly discussed this, so I'm going to go through these relatively quickly, and you'll have the notes that we've done underneath them. So it's through these different approaches that they're going to take as far as financing the things. And then when they're financing, even if they get to the 1.3, how much of this is through grants, concessional, non-debt creating instruments? Very important to understand whether it's going to put developing countries into more debt. Next slide. So this is two key people who've been involved with this process as far as coordinating the quantifier goal on climate finance. Zahir, who was the South African negotiator, but then shifted to the United Arab Emirates, and I think that's where he still is. And Fiona Gilbert, who's also from Australia. They're really good. They're people, they achieved nearly a success in Azerbaijan. We didn't get exactly what we wanted, and there were reasons behind that, but we won't go into that here. If we move to the next slide. So again, on the finance, a new quantified goal, public financing, private international financing, private domestic financing. How can you ensure that you've got a whole map of where that financing stuff is going to come from? And again, that's going to be part of what Brazil will be doing. Next slide. Try to put it in a kind of visual, but in a sense, if you think about it, it's domestic mobilization, it's overseas development aid, it's new financial mechanisms, and then it's multilateral development banks. Next slide. Adaptation funding hasn't had as much. I think it's only had 21 billion kind of put forward up to 2025, but there's an attempt to push to 130 billion by the time, 28 billion is what I think we are now, but I mean the issue would be how we make sure that it moves up to 130 billion, because, you know, mitigation and adaptation need to have as much work done on them as they possibly can. There'll be work through the commercial banks, there'll be work through private equity and venture capital. We've put notes on those, but I'm not going to go into more depth because I'm aware that we're taking longer than we should. If we go to the next slide.
Yeah, so just
yeah, go.
Again, to highlight some key people, next slide, Charles. Thanks. On the Loss and Damage Fund board, some co-chairs from France and as well from South Africa, Richard Sherman and Jean-Christophe Donielier. And then the president who, the executive director for the fund is Ibrahima Cheikh Diong, and he's from Senegal. So those are important people to know if you're following the Loss and Damage Fund. Next slide, please. This is just a breakdown of the fund's board. It's broken up regionally, so we have 12 member countries from developed parties and then 14 from developing or emerging economies. And then further, it's broken down regionally from there. So for your awareness, you can see that. And then we'll go to the next slide. And Felix, if you want to say some words about the NDCs.
Yeah, I think we're only at 15. We're now at 19 countries out of 199 that have actually submitted their NDCs. Clearly, this one talks about what the temperature rise would be prior to Paris, after Glasgow, or before Glasgow, after Glasgow. And the recent report in 23 talked about a 2.5 to 2.9 is where our trajectory is. So there will need to be a peak in 2025 if we're going to start to try and hit the 1.5. I think we've lost 1.5. So the issue is how close to 1.5 can we do? We move to the next slide. WRI produced a very nice explanation of what they think the approach should be. And again, with this slide, there's a lot of notes underneath it. I'm not going to go into it. You'll be able to look at it and use it as you see fit. Next slide. So at least 90% of coal reserves, and remember, Australia will be, if it gets the presidency of COP31, coal will be a very important issue in that presidency. 60% of oil and gas must stay under the ground. You move to the next slide. I think it's Jamie.
Yeah, so I've touched on the global goal on adaptation before, so I won't go into too much detail here. But just to say that right now in the process, there were, 1,000 or so indicators that were kind of identified. Now they have elected an expert group. This group will meet at the SBs, and then hopefully by COP30, we'll have narrowed these targets down to some really key indicators on specific sectoral targets to address kind of where countries are in their progress on adaptation and resilience. Okay, next slide, please.
Yeah, I mean, the very important decision taken by the COP at Baku on the adoption of Article 6 now opens the door for voluntary carbon markets. And in the notes, I'll go over, you'll see her going over 6.2 and what that means, and 6.4, which were the two issues. Now, though it's been operationalized, the issue will be a report on the operationalization of Article 6. And so it would be very important in Bonn to see where we are and whether there have been anything that needs further decision making. Next slide.
So this is a roadmap of the Paris rule book that kind of outlines established in 2015 and then goes to 2050, and where are kind of the main benchmarks along the way. So you can see we're here at 2025, and the goal is to communicate the new NDCs for the next 10 years for country parties. Then again, we'll have another global stocktake process in 2028, so 3 years' time, where we can see how far we've come on those new NDCs. Then again, 2030, it's a 5-year process. We will communicate the new NDCs again, with ultimately the goal of all of these NDCs to be at net zero emissions and achieving climate resilience ideally by 2050, and again keeping that temperature below 1.5 degrees warming. Okay, next slide, Felix.
Thank you. And so High Level Champion has a number of priorities. They're looking to provide additional transparency and credibility to existing climate actions. So the action agenda that falls under the High Level Champion, the High Level Champion from the previous COP works with the High Level Champion of this COP. It's a 2-year term, so that it ensures some continuity of approach to engaging with stakeholders and getting them together so that they can, in a sense, be part of the implementation engine. That's what in a sense, the role of the High Level Champion is. It's to promote the Marrakesh Partnership, to promote the action agenda, to focus on implementation, where you have particular, and we'll come to that, initiatives which are either promoted by member states, so it's including stakeholders, but it might be run by member states, or promoted by UN bodies, or by stakeholders coming together themselves. So it's a really important process. Next slide.
All right, so to talk a little bit about negotiating groups and some more key people, we can go to the next slide. So there are ways that countries and parties kind of tend to group themselves in order to make more collective decisions, because it would be almost impossible for if we all had, hundreds of different opinions to kind of come together and make any real choices. So these are some of the typical groups that we see and how they are kind of split off. And we'll show a nice map in a couple of slides that demonstrates, where these groups overlap and where countries often fall and make decisions. So yeah, typically these groups are helpful because unless you are, a major economy like China or the United States, for example, it is you have the power to kind of make a one decision by yourself, but otherwise these groups are helpful for kind of building consensus. Okay, so some of the groups listed, G77 in China, and we also have the chairs for all of these groups listed, and then in parentheses, typically the number of parties and countries, which changes a little bit, but that are a part of these groups. So G77 in China is one of the largest. It's 135 members, and the current president is the Republic of Iraq. The European Union, of course, this is a typical voting bloc. The Africa Group, Arab States, Environmental Integrity Group. This is a group that often is a very ambitious group, makes decisions that are highly motivated to like a positive climate future. There is a group of the LDCs, the least developed countries, the Alliance of Small Island States. So some of the most vulnerable groups, or AOSIS is how you may see them referred to. And then there is the V20. We can go to the next group. Next slide, sorry. So a couple other negotiating groups to highlight. The umbrella group, often the United States, Canada, Australia, that falls in this group. OPEC, or the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, they obviously have kind of their own motivations within these climate conferences. They are often vote as a group. ILAC, which is Latin American and the Caribbean. BASIC, which will probably be a very important negotiating group this COP, as Brazil is a part of that. BASIC it stands for Brazil, South Africa, China, and India. So some of the largest economies. in the world. There is the like-minded group, the Coalition of Rainforest Nations, ALBA, and Grupo Sur. So those are a few of the main negotiating groups. And we can go to the next slide. Probably a bit hard to see because the text is small, but this just shows you kind of a breakdown in the boxes of where certain countries fall. And you can see there is a lot of overlap. So for example, if we look at the Bahamas in the upper left-hand corner, they fall in both the G77 and China, as well as the SIDS, or Small Island Developing States group. So you'll often see them kind of voting in places like that. So this is taken from the Ringo website, one of the research and university constituency groups. And it's a bit out of date now. It's an older map. So some of these countries have kind of moved around in position. But yeah, it's still a really helpful overview that you can take a closer look at once you have the slides. And I'll pass it back to you, Felix, and the next slide.
Yeah, so this is a useful slide because you should have it as a little note somewhere with you, because the different documents that come out from the Secretariat will have particular words next to them. They'll have numbers, but they'll have particular words. So if it's an information document, it'll have INF. It's a technical one, it'll have TP. If it's limited distribution, that might be draft decisions within, say, Subster or SPI, because not everybody's in the room. It'll have a limited distribution. If it's an addendum, some added stuff, it'll have add. If it's a revision of any of the documents above, it's a revision, and if it's a correction, it's COR. It's worth just having those. It's very simple. Put it on one of your back of one of your cards, just so you can identify the documents. The next slide, please. Yeah, so the next two slides will look at some of the key people. And again, I've taken these from the Earth Negotiations Bulletin. If you know what someone looks like, it's a lot easier to find them in the room. And so we've got the COP29 president, we've got the high-level champion from COP28, who's still very active, ex-WWF staff member. You've got the executive secretary for UNFCCC, Simon. You've got the high-level champion from COP29. You've got Ambassador Perez from Switzerland, who has been an amazing advocate. And if you get my book on Heroes of Environmental Diplomacy, there's a chapter on him, on his work on chemicals. The next slide, please. And here's some of the others. So Hannah worked very effectively as the special envoy during the UAE presidency. You've got Madeleine, who's from Senegal, who was, I think still is speaking on behalf of the LDCs. Harry, was the SBI chair before, and then you've got the your president of UNEA. So though we haven't mentioned it, the Environmental Assembly, United Nations Environmental Assembly, will happen a couple of weeks after the COP. So depending on where we are, ministers will have another opportunity at the beginning of December to come together, maybe not to make decisions, but to be able to think about where they're going as they move to COP31. If you move to the next slide. So this we thought would be interesting, and this is what a government brief will include. And to be honest, this is what your background document, what you should be taking to a UN meeting is. They will have the papers of the UN meeting, including relevant reports and previous decisions. You should have those so you know what was taken before. What is the negotiating history? And so some of that's very easy. Just download the Earth Negotiation Bulletin summary documents, maybe, from each of the last 4 or 5 COPs. What is the government's interest? So what would your interest be? What are their objectives? These will be within their little file. It would have initially been a file they would have carried around. Now it's probably a website that you can't get access to. What are the key issues of the delegation? They're not going to be interested in everything, unless there may be a large group like the European Union. They'll be interested in specific things. What's the substantive background material? If there's a legal decision to be taken, like on the carbon markets, there'll be a really important thing behind it, which tells them what that implication of that decision will be. What's the state of the position of governments that they're going to be negotiating in? Have they met them beforehand? So, you know, one of the problems in one of the negotiations I was in was that they weren't meeting between the meetings of Subster. And so once they started to meet informally, they were able to move the issues forward. What are the names of the key peoples on other delegations? So they're doing the same thing as we are. They're collecting the names of the key people, and where possible, they'll have, if they're sensible, they'll have pictures of them as well. And what are their plans to coordinate with other groups? We saw how many other groups there are. Those won't all be playing a role in every negotiation necessarily. There'll be particular places where they'll do it. And what are their suggested amendments that the delegation can place into the negotiations, and guidance on when they have to go back to capital. You know, they'll have red lines in particular areas. It's what they call it. They don't want to go beyond that. If they need to, they'll have to go back to capitals. Next slide. So this is just to give you an idea of how they're thinking about it. So when a government approach to speaking, they'll speak at the beginning, and then you should listen to what they're saying. What is their intervention going to achieve? So at that very beginning, it should be identifying their key points. What is the intervention not talking about is also important. Ensure that the intervention can ensure the intervention cannot be misunderstood. So the government will be making it as simple as they can. And often they will repeat this during a number of interventions, so it's clear what the issues that they want to move forward. During the debate, when this is getting to the decision making, they'll have the same objectives as the negotiations will go on. And again, depends on when the red line will be. And they will be looking at whether these are taking part in formal or non-formal. And so the US advice to their staff is tell them what you're going to say in their first instance, say it, tell them what you said, so repeat it at the end, and then keep saying the same thing, so that it's, you know, in a huge meeting, you can lose stuff. So you have to keep it very, very simple. Next slide.
All right, so ways to stay up to date. I've seen a couple of questions in the Q&A about where can we get these documents, the agendas, the negotiation texts as they come out. So a couple of key things to highlight. One is the UNFCCC website. There is a ton of information here where they post documents quite frequently throughout the COP process as soon as they're available. On the ground for negotiations, as well as a lot of information about upcoming meetings, logistics, etc. So that's a really valuable website. COP30, the president's website has launched, so you can check out that, especially to explore information about their initiatives, and there's information about accommodations and the venue and things like that on the website. The provisional schedule is this is kind of gives you the ideas of the key issues, and then we'll get a more updated agenda closer to the event. And then there is a daily schedule that's listed online. And again, it's also going to be on those CCTV monitors, which will be all around the venue at Bonn and in Belém. And that's where you can get really the most up-to-date information about when negotiations are scheduled, because sometimes they'll change, you know, within an hour of when they were supposed to be scheduled, because countries can't agree. So they need to go back to contact groups and kind of reassess. We also have linked here the side event schedule. So these will take place throughout Bonn and throughout Belém, and it's a great place to check out those. And then a couple of other things to highlight, these last three bullets, the Earth negotiations bulletin. This is a great summary that usually comes out the morning after. that is a summary of the day before, the negotiations, where they are, really helpful information about what's going on in the corridors. So that's a great resource. There's the Eco Daily newsletter that's a little more environmental justice focused. And then Third World also releases updates and briefings all the time. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is just a little bit more about the code of conduct. The UNFCCC hosts briefings on these about ways that you can participate appropriately, and also for like safety and health guidance, there is information there in case there is an issue on the ground. But I won't go into detail there. Okay, let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit more about COP30, what it's going to look like, pavilions, accommodations, the blue and green zone. So Belém is kind of in the works of their logistics. We have some information, but not all of it yet, especially around accommodation. There's information that is still coming out. The size of Belém is also to be determined. We don't know the number of allocated badges yet. Baku was over 60,000 people and Dubai was over 100,000 registered. So we'll see how Belém kind of compares in size to that. We can go to the next slide. So this is just to really give you a zoomed out picture. Of course, we have South America, then we zoom into the country of Brazil, the province of Pará, and then you can see Belém is this kind of coastal city, or a city that's right on this river delta. And then it zoomed in even further. The venue is going to be hosted at City Park. And there's going to be 6 thematic pavilions that are a part of the Brazilian initiative within the Blue Zone. The blue zone is on the right hand and the green zone is on the left. So you have to have a specific badge to enter the blue zone, and the green zone is a separate badge. The blue zone is where all of the negotiations will happen, official side events and pavilions. And then the green zone often is where kind of more informal networking and groups that may not have an official badge are kind of located. We can go to the next slide. So this is just a little bit more of a breakdown of kind of what they expect the blue and green zones to look like. You can take a closer look at this when you have it on your own screens. We can go to the next slide. And Felix, actually, I'll pass it to you to talk a little bit more about this exhibition center.
Yeah, so the idea the idea is to have in the Hangar Convention and Fair Center of the Amazon, which will be used as part of the blue and green zone. It's not just that you'll have pavilions. And what I'm unclear about, having just spoken with the local government coordinators, is whether the 6 themes will apply to all of the pavilions. And so he thinks at the moment that is the Brazilian thinking, and therefore the question is, how is that going to play out? We'll find out more in Bonn, because clearly Brazil will have had input from a lot of their special advisors on what they're suggesting. The idea of theming in the past has been that you've had a particular day for different themes. If the pavilions are all meant to be themed, it changes the dynamics a bit, and we're a little unsure about that. Next slide. Yeah, just another picture of what's being built, and again, where the things are. Next slide. Again, just the same thing. If you move to the next slide, I'm trying to hurry it up because I'm aware that we're taking a lot more. So just on the accommodation at COP30. So in a sense, there was only 28,000 beds originally. They're trying to move it up to 40 to 50,000. They've separated the high level segment to the week before, so that may help as far as the number of people coming. They're working to convert schools and some army bases and potentially some ships that would be in the harbor for them. They're also looking at neighboring cities. So the problem you're going to have is they will release the accommodation at Bonn. So the accommodation details will go up, but you won't know whether you've got accreditation till I think September. And so you have to make a decision. I think you're definitely going to get one pass, but how many other passes will you get? And so to some extent, you'll have to make a decision at least or prioritize who the people you think might get passes and might be able to go. Next slide.
All right, so we mentioned side events. These happen. They're formal events that organizations apply for, and then the Secretariat helps select and merge with other organizations on similar themes. We have here listed what the themes were for kind of COP30 and these SB62 events, and these will be going on throughout the negotiation. So it's a great thing to attend if you're interested in a particular topic. Again, in that information on like how to stay up to date, we've listed the side event schedule, so you can check out that and attend where it is of interest. Okay, and then next slide. And Felix, back to you to talk a little bit more about what happens beyond the negotiations.
Yeah, so this is going back to some of the initiatives that have been made. So if you could move to the next slide. And we're getting towards the end. There's only about, I think, seven slides left. So there is the deforestation declaration. It's part of what I would call the action agenda. There's the global methane pledge by a number of countries. They can't get a deal on what they want on methane reduction in the negotiations, so they're doing it outside. And if they get to a point where pretty much everyone's signed up, then they can move that into the negotiations. There's the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, and that is at the moment in a bit of a mess. I'll come to that in a second. But there are lots of these initiatives that are being done that like the Beyond Oil and Gas approach, where a number of countries are trying to move much faster than the others. So these coalitions are important. What's unclear is how those could be, in a sense, be made more transparent in one place. And no one managed to do that in Baku. And I think they did a little bit in Dubai, but these processes need to be much more clearly signposted so people can see what's happening. If you could move to the next slide. So there were a number of sector breakthroughs that they did. And this included things like aluminium, aviation. Some of these come back into policy discussions. So you'll find, again, a number of industry initiatives around things like buses or heavy vehicles. And though these are outside of the formal negotiations, they're important that they're happening. And then the question is, if they can bring their good practice in, how can they then share that with other countries? So not all countries are involved in this. It's only those who signed up. The next slide, this is a mess. So partly because of the attack by the Republicans on ESG reporting, environment, social governance reporting, a number of, pretty much all of the American banks have pulled out. A number of the asset managers have pulled out. It's unclear where this is going to go. It might be clearer after Bonn, but the UN Environment Programme's Finance Initiative is where you go to find information on that. Next slide.
Yeah, so another coalition to highlight is this Race to Zero. This goes beyond party countries, and we see really a large number of non-state actors, companies, financial institutions, cities and municipal governments, educational institutes and healthcare institutes who have committed to kind of net zero within 12 months of joining this coalition. The idea is that you will have a plan on how you'll reach net zero, and it's kind of a way to take some more granular action even when the country sometimes seems like it's at a standstill. Next slide. And I actually just touched on this, so you can go to the next one. I know we're at time, so these are the last two slides. So just to recall the key issues again that are going to be at this Bonn meeting and at COP30, the NDCs, nationally determined contributions, the Baku Unity Pact or the finance goal, the Baku to Belém roadmap for 1.3 trillion, the fund for responding to loss and damage, this indicators process with a global goal on adaptation, operationalizing Article 6 in those carbon markets, and then the Just Transition Work Program. These are the key issues that you're probably going to hear a lot about throughout Bonn and the COP. Next slide. These are some key dates for 2025. So you may want to screenshot, or again, we'll share these slides so you have them. But this is information all about when those key dates will be happening. And a lot of these be in the lead up to COP30. Which again is November 10th to 21 in Belém. So yeah, I think we'll pause there. And we're right at the hour. I know we didn't get a chance to take questions, but we will take your questions from the chat and maybe write some responses to them and share them in an email after this with the recording and the slides. So just to say thanks so much for attending, and Felix, I'll pass it to you, and Charles for some last words.
Well, I think what we might do is, if you need to go, that's fine, and we'll answer whatever we can, and then we're not doing raise hands, so just for those people, we'll answer the questions we can, and then the ones we can't, I'll come back to you if that's okay.
Felix, do you want to do the pop quiz?
Yeah, so we've got a quiz we're going to ask you to fill in before we go into answering the questions. If you could do that, Charles, that would be great.
And sorry, I do need to run for my next meeting, but thanks everyone. And yeah, looking forward to your questions. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jamie. The poll is populating nicely, so we'll give it a few more moments for everyone to take part, and then we'll save it.
And thank you for doing this, because it gives us an idea of, what you were hoping to get out of this session. Because, we've taken a viewpoint, but we've been involved in this process for so long. We may have balanced it wrong, or we could have balanced it better for you. So it will help us to do the next one, which will be before COP30. We'll do it in late October, so people have as much information as they can. And we really thank you for coming to the process. And in the slide that I had up earlier, it has my details if you want to follow up. I do training on other other different UN processes as well, and the environmental lobbying at the UN book, we'll be launching that at the UN bookshop during the high-level political forum, which will be on the 16th of July. So if you happen to be in New York for the high-level political forum, then do come along, and it should be a lot of fun. I think maybe give it 30 seconds more and then we'll stop.
Okay. Okay, Felix, we have a couple more. I'm going to just wait until we have 100. We're almost at 100. So we still have a lot of people answering the questions.
Okay.
So maybe give it another moment. Okay, we're at 100. So why don't we'll save it.
Yeah.
And those are the results. if anybody wants to take a screenshot, and Felix will have that info to share. Okay. Felix, do you want to look at any of the questions?
Yeah,
I answered a lot in writing, but there's quite a few in there that would perhaps.
okay. Let me look through it and see.
Well,
Mandated events. The first one by that Ivana said is during the COP negotiations, they may decide to look at an issue, but not have it as a negotiation. So oceans is a good idea. So one of the previous COPs, I can't remember which one, it may have been Glasgow, decided they wanted to do some dialogues on oceans. And so that was one of the mandated events. Okay. So my observation, the conference and the ratification highly impact to create awareness of governments. Number two conferences. What is the impact deemed to reduce? So the reduction in carbon emissions will be reflected in the national determined contributions and their reports on mitigation and adaptation. And they have to report that. So if a country says it's done something, there is a body, I can't remember what it's called, within there, which someone can say, well, we're not sure that that's true. So I think, if they've put forward a nationally determined contribution, ideally what people should do is use their parliaments to every year get a government to report on their progress to what they're doing. I would join that. Well, as far as the meeting is open to the public, it's only the plenary. Well, there's nothing's open to the public. You have to attend BON as an accredited organization representative. So nothing's open to the public.
I'm going to add one thing. Now in recent years, there is now the ability for virtual participation. So any of the any entity that has observer status and has been granted at least one in-person space is also offered virtual spaces. And so the way to at least attend virtually is to make contact with an observer body and ask if they have any virtual spaces available. And many will happily register you as a virtual user.
That's great. We've got links. We've put those in the thing, so you'll get that. Yeah, unfortunately it is over bureaucratic, and there are processes to simplify, but so far it's not an easy thing to do because they have particular agreements that they have to make, and so what's needed is an overview of the different suggestions of reform, and they have to get it, I think, very simple. And I would take baby steps just because of where we are in the world at the moment. Look for small things that can be done to simplify the over bureaucratic process. I would like to know where one goes to download documents. Well, so you go to the UNFCCC website to download documents. Any document that's going to be in front of BON will be there before we get to BON, so you'll have no problem in doing that. Well, so there are no decisions taken between SB 62 and COP. What there will, I mean, there are no final decisions at SB 62. There is proposed decisions that have to go to the COP for being agreed. But there are, in certain cases, the need to do intersessional meetings. So loss and damage had, I think, 7 meetings. The global stock take had some meetings. The adaptation goal had some meetings. But they ultimately would be leading into proposing text to what would be then, if it's the next COP, SB 63. So it would have to still go through the SB to go to the COP for an agreement. SB 602, we've not got that far yet, but hopefully we won't. What are the outcomes of that species called? Well, they're not outcomes. They're in a sense, under those different SBs that we indicated, there'll be a particular agreement or a part agreement that will be going to the COP, and probably will have to then go into further negotiations under SB 63. Let me just move down. Right. Oops, it wasn't. I have a screen that allows me to pull it down, but it doesn't. I think particularly as you saw with the intent of Brazil to do a lot of work with indigenous peoples, they have a special advisor. They have identified it as an area. I think that will be will be happening. But often you'll have NGOs or women's groups or youth groups who will be, in a sense, acting on behalf of marginal groups in their country. I'm not sure I understand the issue on that Chris has got. Maybe email me, Chris, and I'll ask. But as far as no accreditation and travel waivers for Bonn, you have to be accredited and you have to fund yourself through your organization or through a foundation. So I am sure that in different countries, there will be organizations that will be monitoring the progress that's being made by that particular host country. I mean, you partly saw that because Brazil had set specific Brazilian special envoys to help that process. I think different presidencies have had different successes. I had very low expectations of the Azerbaijan presidency, and in the end I think they did a really good job. And so I think we have great hopes for Brazil. It'll depend on the leadership in the country. Clearly, for example, if you want to look at a bad presidency, then you would look at Denmark, and I would suggest that you you Google Richard Black Copenhagen failures, BBC, and he was the BBC correspondent for Copenhagen. Richard Black, Copenhagen failures, and he's got, I think, 10 points on why it failed, and partly it failed because the president of the COP wasn't in sync with the president, the prime minister of the country. As far as the Yongo stuff, you should send a note to Jamie, and she can probably add you. Some of the, I mean, youth constituency changes, and sometimes things get lost because it's dependent on the leadership at that particular position. As far as sponsorship, she said that they have some, but it'll probably go to people who are actively already involved in the negotiations. Otherwise, you have to look for funding it yourself. Well, I mean, if you're approaching anyone who's running like the Green Climate Fund or the loss and damage thing, it's relatively easy. I mean, but Jamie would help you if it's the loss and damage fund. I'm not engaged with the adaptation fund, but I mean, Richard Sherman, who, for example, co-chairs it, used to work for Stakeholder Forum. And so, you know, he's very pro stakeholder engagement. I've answered the issue on the housing. You can't find government briefs. It's kept for the government. Some governments will allow stakeholders on their delegation. You should ask whether your government does that. I mean, Brazil will have a lot of stakeholders on their delegation, so they will see the brief, but they'll have to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Do you have any pointers? Approach board member, I've dealt with that. They were I think the yellow were updated. I updated most of them. If one of them's wrong, then it's my fault. I mean, as far as engaging for funding, it's up to the different NGO groups to fund themselves. So it's it's not something that the UN does. Oops, sorry, my down button's not working so good. Right. Yeah, the researchers go through the Ringo group, so join the Ringo. So do UNFCCC Ringo, and you'll find the website where you can engage. I think Charles answered the accreditation virtually. You have to be an accredited organization. I think you have to have someone who's there already accredited, but you could check on the website. If you're a local government one, then join the local government constituency, go on the website and find that. I don't think I've got any more. I mean, not everything will be on the virtual thing. So what may be on is all the side events. What will be on is the plenaries. But once you move to under plenaries, it's all, I mean, not even stakeholders can attend. So that's my answer to the questions. Charles?
Okay, Felix, with that, I think it's probably a good time for us to wrap up. So I'll just say some closing words, and that is just to say many thanks to everyone who joined us today. Most people have dropped out, but there's about 100 or more people still with us. Special thanks to Felix and Jamie for another insightful capacity building webinar. And as mentioned earlier, the meeting is being recorded, and a link to the recording and the presentation will be sent to you via the Zoom platform tomorrow by an email. So with that, I'll say thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.